A man was walking along a narrow path, not paying much attention to what he was doing. Suddenly, he slipped over the edge of a cliff. As he fell, he grabbed a branch growing from the side of the cliff. Realizing he couldn't hang on for long, he called for help. Is anybody up there? He hears a voice that says, "Yes, I'm here." "Who's that?" "The Lord." "Lord, help me." "Do you trust me?" "I trust you completely, Lord." "Good. Let go of the branch." "What?" "I said let go of the branch." He pauses. "Is there anybody else up there?" I remember reading this story a few days ago, and it caught my interest because it seemed to be a perfect description when we encounter uncertainty in our own personal lives and when we see turbulent events occurring throughout our community, nation, and the world. We probably have that response. Is there anybody up there? When are you going to do something about it and fix it? How is this situation going to end, and will I be okay in the end? Today's gospel text calls us to remember that to be a disciple of Christ is to embrace living on the edge. Embracing living on the edge means that we don't have all the answers all the time. And we don't always understand what's going on, but God does. And our call is to stay focused on this and encourage one another to remember and show and bring this to the world. Our faith may fail, but the reality of God won't. As this gospel opens, the writer instructs us that this is the only visit by Jesus and the disciples to Jerusalem after a tense interaction with religious authorities. You know, if you read in the 12th chapter, Jesus has been arguing, kind of going back and forth with the scribes. He's kind of also, you see, where the lady who put 2 pennies in, people are there at the treasury putting in, and he acknowledged the lady who made true sacrifice by what she put in, but how the others it was really more of a show than it really was an act of serious worship. So he's been going back and forth with people in the temple. Jesus seems to have had enough and leaves out the temple with the disciples. The disciples respond as you would expect, somebody who's not used to a big town. The disciples, they see this huge temple complex, and indeed it is a marvelous sight. I mean, the construction on this temple began in 20 BC, and around Jesus' times, they were really just putting the final steps on the temple. And the temple was located at the top of a mountain. It was huge. The historian Josephus reports that the walls that surround it were like a stadium in length on each side, 600 feet high. The temple is built on huge blocks. Some of the blocks, when you look at it, would be equivalent to a 15-story building. Archaeologists have uncovered like stones that are at the base of the temple that were like 500 tons. 500-ton marble. And on top of that 500-ton marble, some of them were covered with pure gold. So we're talking about a massive, massive structure. Like I said, the white marble is adorned with gold, and when you see it in the sunshine, it would probably blind you, just the sight of it, as the sun beams off all the gold on these white stones. It was truly one of the wonders of the world, and even more significantly for the Jewish people of that time, that's where God made his earthly home. I mean, to put it in perspective for us, it would be like the White House or the Capitol building or the Empire State Building. To see something so massive, something so largely that you knew took a lot of time to build, you're in awe when you see it. So our faith, though, is like that temple. It's like an immovable object at times. Our faith in God is really the stones of the temple in this gospel reading. The bricks and mortars of the temple reveal God's presence. The temple is trustworthy. We can see it and feel it. As long as it's there, we trust God is near. That's how our faith works. As long as we have faith, we can trust that God is near. So we depend on the physical temple. We depend on our faith. We put our faith in faith. But what happens when the temple is destroyed? What happens when our faith no longer works? How do we know God is near? How do we trust that what God is doing? Like the temple, our faith is not the most important thing. It's not our ability to trust in God that counts. It's really God that counts. We can get so caught up trusting our faith that we don't realize that God is trustworthy. Our faith doesn't save us. It doesn't comfort us. It doesn't love us. God does those things for us. Faith is merely a recognition of that. As your life has changed, has your faith changed? Have the difficulties of your life challenged your faith? What was the situation that made you realize that your faith wasn't working? It could have been illness of yourself or illness of another individual. It could be the death of someone loved, the loss of finances or a job. It could be disappointment in political leaders. Whether you are conservative, you might have been disappointed under the Obama administration. Whether you are a liberal, you might be disappointed under the Trump administration. But the thing is, they failed. The church. We hear a lot, about sex scandals, child abuse, institutions that fail. I surmise that people respond in 3 different ways. We meet some people when that crux of faith comes. They ignore the situation and they remain a little childish. They ignore life and cling to an immature faith that kind of feels unreal, that, everything's okay, everything's okay, my faith will get me through it, not really taking into consideration what's really happened. Others just throw out faith altogether. They're just like, I'm not going to do this. And some tweak their faith to allow it to fit in part of their life, but not the whole thing. If we are going to be effective witnesses about God to the world, we need to be honest and recognize our faith isn't good enough and doesn't work sometimes. These are the moments when we feel like we're on the edge. Wherever it is that our faith fails us, the reality of God steps in. Our faith cannot sustain us, but God can. Our faith cannot conquer death. God does. Our faith is not divine. God is. Our faith doesn't hold us and comfort us and love us. God does. If your faith is not enough for you, if it's failing you, if it cannot provide what you need in your life, good. Quit relying on it. God is there, and regardless of your faith, God is sustaining you and holding you and loving you and walking with you, especially if you doubt it, especially if you can't see it or understand it, especially if you don't believe it, especially if you have no faith in it. In the gospel text, Jesus warns us not to get caught up in signs about the destruction of the temple. He warns us not to get concerned about earthquakes, wars, and famines. He cautions us not to pay attention to people who come along and proclaim they have all the answers and the truth. The temptation is to see those things and hear those things and then trust in those things. But they can't sustain us any more than our faith can. At their absolute best, the most they can do is remind us that God is actually near and still at work. Even if we decide to pay attention to the earthquakes, the rattling of war horns, or to follow the new philosophies or philosophers who proclaim they have the answer, it does not change who Christ is. Maybe your life has outpaced your faith right now, or someone's life you know, but it hasn't outpaced the triune God. The triune God is still at work creating, redeeming, and empowering. You might not be able to trust your faith, but you can trust that you are loved, you are forgiven, and you are not alone. When we remember this, we can embrace living on the edge and embrace one another with the love of God to comfort one another. I close with the words from the hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness." All All I have needed, thy hand has provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is God's faith, not mine. Now go and embrace living on the edge. Amen.